Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. John Marenbon to discuss the great philosopher of late antiquity, Boethius, and his masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. Dr. Marenbon is a British philosopher and Fellow of Trinity College at Cambridge. His area of specialization focuses on medieval philosophy in general, and he has written extensive works on both medieval philosophy and Boethius, and has written works such as the Cambridge Companion to Boethius and the Great Medieval Thinkers Monograph on Boethius. Dr. Marenbon, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So I figured we could just dive right in. Who was Boethius, and what are some of his great accomplishments?
So Boethius was born in 476, and that was the year when the aptly called Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, the last Western Roman emperor, was deposed. So that gives you some sort of idea of the times in which he's living. The Roman Empire has just gone, but of course its traces remain. And Boethius himself was to live under the rule of the Goths. Now, as well as situating him in time, an important thing to do is to situate him socially. This makes a lot of difference to the whole of his life and what he was able to do. And Boethius was a very, very grand aristocrat. He was born into a noble and rich and influential Roman family, and when his parents died, he was adopted into an even more important one. And these families, although the Goths were ruling, they were allowed to continue the ceremonial of the Roman Empire. So, for instance, both of Boethius's sons became consuls. That really meant very little in terms of real power, but it meant a lot in terms of honor. Meanwhile, Boethius himself, for most of his life, devoted himself to, if you like, learned leisure. He didn't have to work for his living. He could get manuscripts from where he liked. For most of his life, he was engaged in trying to make the heritage of teaching about the liberal arts, such as arithmetic and music, and probably also astronomy and geometry, but especially logic, available in Latin. There were schools which discussed these things in Greek, but not in Latin. Boethius himself learned Greek perfectly and was able to translate into Latin and was able to use his learning to comment on these works. That and a certain amount of theology occupied him for most of his life. And it was only at the end when he was called to be involved in politics, and this turned out to be disastrous. And I'm sure we'll discuss these circumstances in more detail, but it was only right at the end that he writes the work for which he's best known, called The Consolation of Philosophy. But I mean, it's worth stressing that really everything he wrote was, well, very interesting and very, very important for the Middle Ages, not just the Consolation.
Right. If I could maybe follow up, what sort of influence did he exercise over the medieval period? As I understand it, prior to some of Aristotle's main works being reintroduced into the Latin-speaking world, Boethius's philosophical and theological writings were extensively commented upon up to and even including the 13th century.
Yes, I mean, this perhaps makes more sense when we've talked a bit more about Boethius himself. But he first of all, he provides these textbooks to arithmetic and music. the other textbooks don't survive. These are mostly translations based on Greek sources, and they are absolutely standard textbooks throughout the Middle Ages, not just the early Middle Ages. So his De Arithmetica and De Musica, commented on, enormously important. With regard to logic, he translated almost all of Aristotle's logical works, and he wrote commentaries, on some cases more than one commentary on some of them, and also provided logical textbooks. That sort of corpus of material was very important really between the late 10th and the end of the 12th century. It was sort of absolutely fundamental to what happened there. But the translations that he made, with perhaps a few small revisions, remain the standard translations, again, right through the Middle Ages. Then he wrote the so-called opuscula sacra, the little theological treatises, a set of 5 rather different works, which were transmitted together usually. And people started reading these from the 9th century onwards. And again, there's a pretty continuous tradition with sort of ups and downs. So you get lots of 12th century commentaries, but also Aquinas in the 13th century comments on 2 of them, and also from the late Middle Ages, there are quite a lot of commentaries too. So that's continuous. And then the Consolation of Philosophy has this extraordinary tradition. Again, the reading of it seems to start around 800. The first so enthusiastic reader we know of it is Alcuin, the Englishman who worked at the court of Charlemagne, and he probably quotes it just a bit before 800. But then it has this big tradition in Latin, but also in the vernacular. So it gets translated into almost every medieval language you can think of. And it's if you're interested in the idea of philosophy outside the universities in the later Middle Ages, which is, I think, a new and really sort of fertile, interesting field, that it's a central text for it. It's absolutely the central text to follow it. So, I mean, in all these ways, he's an incredibly important figure in what's made of him. He's also, though, I mean, I think, so there's a view of Boethius, which I call the conduit view. And because people place a lot of emphasis, and I think rightly, on his influence, what people do with him later on. And especially, I think, in older studies, people place a lot of influence on his sources. And there's been lots and lots of work to try to discover exactly which Greek writers he was using for this piece of writing, and so on. And the view is often that all he is like some sort of bridge or conduit, allowing ideas and passages from the ancient world to be transmitted, as the word goes, to the Middle Ages. And although, of course, he is important in that way, I very much want to emphasize that that's not the main thing about Boethius, that he's a very interesting author in his own right. You need to start off by considering what he was doing, what is special to him. And then you can think about how that relates to the past and how it was used in the future.
Right. I mean, I very much agree that sometimes the focus is too much on how Boethius influenced Aquinas or Geoffrey Chaucer rather than considering him a thinker in his own right. But I also wanted to ask, maybe, you mentioned he got involved in politics, and that turned out to be not ideal for him. Could you say maybe more about that? As I understand it, this is sort of the background to why he ends up writing the Consolation.
Yes, absolutely. So he was, as I said, he spent most of his life in these scholarly activities, but he was a known important figure because of his social background in the kingdom. The ruler, who wasn't the person who deposed Romulus Augustulus, who was a Goth called Odoacer, but was somebody who'd been sent by the emperor, the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, to take over from Odoacer. a man called Theodoric, who was a Goth too, but who'd been educated in Constantinople. So he was thought to be a civilized person, and indeed he was quite a highly educated man. But he was sent over to deal with Odoacer, whom he murdered, and took over the kingdom. And from the point of view of the Eastern Emperor, and the Eastern Emperor was the big power, like the superpower of the time. From the point of view of the Eastern Emperor, this took care of two problems, because on the one hand, it took Theodoric and his Gothic army away from Constantinople, which he didn't want. They didn't want it to be there. But it also, if you like, brought back Italy, because Italy was now being ruled officially under his aegis by Theodoric. The trouble is that as time went on, Theodoric thought of himself as being the king of Italy. The Byzantine Empire was far away. He just really wanted to forget about it. The way that he ruled, he was a Christian, but he was a so-called Arian Christian. He followed the Arian heresy about about Christ, and the relationship between Christ the Son and Christ incarnate. And he didn't try to force the Catholic Christians of Italy to become Arians. He operated a sort of religious apartheid. So he and his Gothic soldiers remained Arians. People in Italy remained Catholics. And all that sort of seemed to be fine. It seems that as we get to the sort of around 520, he was aware of tensions with Constantinople, with the Eastern Emperor, and he saw, and this was what would happen in the end, that the Eastern Emperor would want to try to get back Italy properly and get rid of the Goths from Italy. And this is pure speculation. My guess is that his move to make Boethius, so this well-respected figure among the Roman Catholics, to make him his so-called master of the offices, which was roughly his prime minister, his main administrator, main official, was probably designed to try to get the noble Romans on his side, to make them sign up to him. But it misfired for various reasons. Partly because it seems Boethius certainly had a loyalty to those Romans. There seems to be a lot of court intrigue. Boethius, from the way at least he presents himself, was quite an idealist about this, and wouldn't tolerate the people who were corrupt and tried. And they immediately attacked him on what seemed to be his weakest point, which was that he would support Rome and its traditions and its ties with Constantinople against Theodoric. So, however it was done, after a short period, it seems only about a year of his being in power, he finds himself thrown into prison, accused of treason, and also sort of other things. I mean, magic and taking part in magic, and there were strange accusations. But the main point is treason, and it's under those circumstances of imprisonment, awaiting. I think a death sentence had been passed, but obviously hadn't been carried out yet. So, being imprisoned and waiting execution, that Boethius wrote the Consolation of Philosophy.
So it would be an example of, I guess you could call, prison literature. He's writing this while in prison, waiting to be executed.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, he very self-consciously doing so. So he refers back, for instance, to Socrates.
I see.
As a predecessor. It seems, I mean, there's very eminent writer about Boethius in late antiquity of, I suppose, a couple of generations ago, called Pierre Clausel, who wrote a wide-ranging study of the sources and influence of consolation. his view was that Boethius wasn't really in prison. I think his argument was that if he had been in prison, he wouldn't have had access to his books, and he wouldn't have been able to make all the varied references to other works that he does there. And so he says that the prison is sort of literary pretense, and really he was under some sort of house arrest. But that seems unlikely, especially as there is a passage in the Consolation where the character Boethius says, and it seems sort of gesturing to the prison round him, it's not as if I'm in my library, which with its seems to have walls made of ivory, or bookcases made of ivory and so on. He obviously had this exquisite library. And it just seems a bit odd that he would have that if in fact he was in his library and he was just under house arrest.
Right. So then if I can ask, what is the consolation of philosophy? As a work?
Yeah. All right. So I mean, primarily, then, it's on the one side at least, it's a consolation, and the consolation was a particular genre in antiquity. A consolation was written to somebody who was suffering from something. It could be a bereavement, it could be sickness, old age, any of these things which afflict us. And the idea was to, if you like, to reconcile them to what was happening. Consolations were never matters of saying, oh, I'm very sorry, it must be awful, I feel with you. They were matters of saying, if you stand back and look at your position, you'll see that it's not really bad at all, if you take a properly rational view about it. And so this is one aspect of it. It's a work in which you have Boethius himself, who is a character in the dialogue, and Boethius invents this figure of philosophy. I'll say a few words about her in a few moments, but this figure of philosophy, who's his dialogue partner. And philosophy's job, and it's quite a difficult job, is to tell Boethius, who really seems to have lost everything. So he was the most powerful man in the land, and he had every sort of worldly benefit. Suddenly, he's in a prison cell and he's waiting execution. And her job is to convince him that that's not something he should be worried about or upset about, that really everything is perfectly all right. And that indeed is what she succeeds in doing. So the work is designed to show her doing that. So as I say, the work involves this figure of philosophy. Philosophy obviously is an allegorical figure. She's represented as a woman. Various sort of details about it. So we're told that her height sometimes is normal and sometimes she stretches up. She becomes very, very tall, so that her head seems to touch the heavens. And this is the idea of philosophy being something which both reaches up to the heavens, but also comes down to us and which we can understand. And then she's wearing a garment which we're told she made by her own hands, and that it's a garment without any seams. It's a whole, just one whole piece of material, except that it's covered, it's tattered. So and the explanation of this is the idea that philosophy is a whole. There is something which is philosophy and is true philosophy, but that the schools, and this is explained, the different schools of philosophy, and she thinks of people like the Epicureans and the Stoics and so on, all tried to take a part of this truth away for themselves, and in doing so they ripped the garment. So this tells you about the view of philosophy. There is a true philosophy, and the other thing, and we probably talk about this in due course, is that it does seem that philosophy is a personification of pagan philosophy, of the tradition of ancient pagan philosophy. We're not given any reason to think that philosophy is a Christian figure, and she when she talks about those who belong to her her school, we have the tradition of pagan philosophy going back to Socrates and before, and going on through the other great philosophers. So that's a setup. Philosophy has to console Boethius. It's what it's perhaps useful to refer to Boethius as the prisoner when we're thinking about Boethius, the character. So she has to console the prisoner. And the plan of the work is roughly that in the first book, the stage is set. We see the Boethius, the prisoner, completely overcome by grief at what's happened, and philosophy not being very impressed by this, and saying to him, you've forgotten all that I taught you. So Boethius should be a philosopher. If he were a philosopher, he wouldn't be upset at this change of fortune. But mostly, the first book is there to give Boethius, the prisoner, a chance to present his side of the case. And the reason why we have all this detail about his standing up to the corrupt courtiers and so on is through his own presentation. He obviously wanted to put his case for posterity there. And so it's really in the second book that the business of consolation gets going, and the arrangement is a series of firstly we're called the lighter arguments and then heavier arguments, which are designed to show that he hasn't really lost anything worth worrying about. And then when this has been established in book 4, philosophy goes on to talk more about the ordering of the world and how because one of Boethius's prisoner's complaints at the beginning was that the wicked prosper and the good suffer. And philosophy wants to establish there that that isn't the case, that in fact, despite appearances, it's the wicked who suffer and the good who prosper. And then we get on in book 5, which is, from, I suppose, the point of view of philosophers, the most interesting of these books. Boethius, the prisoner, brings up a problem which occurs to him now that he's generally being kind of consoled and assured about what's happened, that God's foreknowledge of all things is incompatible with freedom of choice. And the book is devoted to philosophies giving an answer to that problem. So that's the rough structure of it. And the other thing very important to mention is the form of the work. The form of the work is what's sometimes called Menippean satire or prosimetrum. That's to say, it's written in a combination of prose and verse. No, the bulk of it is prose, but these prose sections are interspersed with verses. The verses are quite often things which Boethius the prisoner is depicted as saying, though sometimes philosophy is the speaker of the verses, and sometimes it's not clear who the speaker of the verses is. That makes it a work with a great sort of literary interest. Boethius tries to use a great variety of different meters in these verses, so it also becomes something of a collection of what you can do with ancient quantitative Latin verse. And it also, and this is something which we might take up, I mean, there are expectations produced by various different genres. So as I say, it belongs to the consolation genre, and that means that people would read it expecting to be, for the reason to be given why Boethius's position is not really such a bad one. It also belongs to this genre of Menippean satire. Now, in Menippean satire, very often authoritative figures were made fun of. That's very interesting because a lot of people will say, yes, but this must be an exception because philosophy is taken very seriously. Right. But that's just a bit, that's a generic explanation that's worth having there. And I suppose, sorry, just while I finish, and this is the end of my brief description, of what the consolation is. Another genre which is involved is that of the protracticus, or introduction to philosophy, because the figure philosophy's view at the beginning, what she says to us is, "You've forgotten your education. I taught you, so you had a philosophical education. You brought up in that way, but you've forgotten it." And she sees her job as re-educating him. So in the process of his being re-educated, the readers are being educated. They're being taught, if you like, about the fundamental ideas of philosophy, which you need to understand. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the work is so important for the future, because you have a lot of fundamental ideas of philosophy being put forward.
And then if I can maybe, before we maybe go into the consolation more deeply, if I can ask, what are some of the main philosophical influences on Boethius's consolation? Are there any allusions to Platonism or Stoicism or Augustine?
Right. So in the context in which Boethius is working, which is the late ancient philosophy, the different schools of philosophy which you'd had in the Hellenistic period have been taken over by just one school, which is thought, people call it the Platonic school, but Aristotle is very important in it too. And in Boethius' lifetime, there are still two big philosophical schools, and actual schools of this philosophy, one in Athens, which was shortly shut down, one in Alexandria, which went on until the Islamic conquest in the middle of the 7th century. And in these schools, people started off by studying Aristotle, and it was accepted doctrine that Plato and Aristotle only superficially seem to be at variance with each other, but that deeply they're in harmony with each other. And indeed, part of Boethius's plan, when he announced a big plan to do with translating, was to write a book in which he showed the harmony of Plato and Aristotle. He doesn't seem to have done that, but he fully subscribed to it. And you see it in the curriculum of these schools, where people would spend a lot of time studying all of Aristotle, including a lot on Aristotelian logic, and then they would go on to studying Platonic dialogues. It used to be thought that Boethius himself may have attended one of these schools. That doesn't seem that likely now, but it does seem that he, if you like, almost attended one from afar. He was able to read the works that they read. So we know that he read in detail lots of Aristotelian logic and lots of and the commentaries on it produced by earlier philosophers of this Platonic Aristotelian stream, in particular by Porphyry, so Plotinus's pupil. He certainly would have read an amount of Plato. We don't know exactly how much Plato he read. We can't be sure that he read all of Plato's dialogues. Now, this sort of Platonic but also Aristotelian school began in the 3rd century with the work of Plotinus. And the famous figures in it were Plotinus, and then Plotinus's pupil Porphyry, and then you have Iamblichus, and finally you have Proclus. It's very, very difficult to say exactly how much of which of those authors Boethius might have known. There are lots of ideas that he has in common with them, but I think you can't say, oh, this bit of Boethius is taken from, let's say, this bit of an Aeneid by Plotinus or something. It was rather a more general drawing on the same sort of same sort of sources, the same sort of ideas. So that's one of the big performative influences on him. The Aristotelian Platonic school, with a great deal of emphasis on Aristotle and Aristotelian logic, which absolutely fascinated him. And also, by Boethius' time, certain aspects of logic had been developed which weren't really in Aristotle. So Aristotle wrote a book called Topics, but the whole theory of topical inference was developed in ways rather different from Aristotle's own in later antiquity. And Boethius writes a textbook on that and writes a commentary on Cicero's work on the Topics, which is related to Aristotle's Learning Vegas. That's another bit of his interest. That's one side, and then yes, the question is the Christian side of things, and how. And no, this is difficult because Boethius, he wasn't a priest; he was a layman. He seems, though, from his these little theological works, and from one of them, which is called De Fide, which is a confession of faith, to have been trying to be a very orthodox Christian. I mean, orthodox in there wasn't at that time a distinction between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in the way now. So just somebody following the general established lines of Christian doctrine. He, in the Opus Per Sacra, he uses and refers very definitely to Augustine, and clearly he read quite a bit of Augustine, especially Augustine on the Trinity. It's hard to know, again, though, how widely he read Augustine. Now, Augustine himself was influenced by this stream of Platonism, or people call Neoplatonism, which comes in Plotinus and Porphyry. Augustine, we know, at a certain stage of his life, had contacts with what he calls books of the Platonists, which seem to be Latin translations of bits of Plotinus and Porphyry. Augustine couldn't, and he knew a bit of Greek, perhaps, but he couldn't read Greek fluently, so he didn't have that direct access, but he had some sort of access to it. And so it may be that Boethius was also getting these ideas through Augustine, though, I mean, if he was reading Augustine, he'd probably think, yes, but I know more about this. I know more about the source of these ideas. But I think Augustine was a big influence in showing him that you could think in ways very strongly influenced by Platonism and the school of Platonism, and yet be a Christian. There were also, of course, Greek, very philosophically minded Greek thinkers who could do that. And there's on the one hand, there's no reason to suppose that Boethius hadn't read some of the Greek church fathers, but there doesn't seem to be any direct. It's hard to find any direct passages, so perhaps that didn't interest him. And I mean, I suppose the other thing to add is there's a big influence of a whole tradition of Latin, specifically Latin culture. So Cicero is a big figure for him. Cicero and his writing, and of course the Latin poets such as Virgil.
So now I figured we could just dive right into maybe the arguments that Lady Philosophy and Boethius give in the Consolation. In the opening book of the work, we find Boethius in his jail cell. He's being comforted by muses regarding his impending execution, and Lady Philosophy appears before him, drives the muses away, and attempts to, as you said, console him on his present struggles and worries. So if I can ask, how does Lady Philosophy attempt to console Boethius? As I understand it, one of the big themes early on is that she tries to argue that Boethius hasn't really lost what truly makes him happy.
Yes, I mean that's in a sense that's got to be the line that she's going to work on. I mean, in my view, she has, I mean, there are two different sorts of argument used. one of which is a more general argument along those lines, and the other of which is a more sort of monolithic and more extreme argument. What the more general argument is designed to do is to say that there are various different sorts of goods, and some of these goods are merely goods in appearance, but others of them are real goods. The goods in appearance are the goods of what you call the goods of fortune. They're things which you may be lucky enough to have, and you might lose. And because it's purely a matter of luck, it's purely a matter of fortune that you have them, you shouldn't complain about losing them. And moreover, if you think about them, none of these things really make you happy. Now, among the goods of fortune, Boethius includes most of the goods which, if you like, sort of ordinary non-philosophical people think of as what make life worthwhile. So there are riches, there are power, there's reputation and pleasure, and so on. But there were all, I mean, like, it was common ground among lots of philosophers, not just philosophers, Platonist philosophers, but almost all of them, to say that what most people, what ordinary people think brings you happiness really doesn't. And it's easy enough to show how power doesn't really bring you happiness, and in fact you can never really have power, and you're always going to be overthrown. And again, what the riches just taken on their own do, and again how pleasure, if you're thinking about sensual pleasure, passes quickly and leaves people dissatisfied. So philosophy deploys all these arguments, and there's nothing, that's really what I think anybody would have expected under the circumstances. Now, part of this, that sort of appeal, is to say that there are a variety of goods that we can have which are not just goods of fortune, and which are genuinely good. And these might include certain things like those people that you love, for instance. Those are real goods. And the pursuit of wisdom would be something else which is a real good. And philosophy's argument on this line is to say that these real goods have not been lost. You still have the love of those who love you. You still have the possibility of wisdom and your learning, and so that's how that argument proceeds. But then, and I mean, you could say, well, that was just a preliminary argument. That was just to soften Boethius, the prisoner, up. Because then you have the more monolithic argument. And this is an argument which I think draws very much on the Platonic notion that things gain the qualities they do by participation in some sort of ideal version of them. And the argument is that all things are good only through participation in the highest good. And the highest good is God. And so if one chases after any sort of good but God, you're really allowing yourself to err, because the only true good is God, and that's where you should set your sights, and that's what you should be interested in. So it is a different stance, I think, from the earlier stance, which says there are some real goods apart from God, but a lot of the things that people take or think of as being good are not really good. I mean, one of the big peculiarities, and this is important when you're trying, I think, to interpret the Consolation, is that having made this argument that the only true good is God, and so we need to, that's what we need to hold on to. We're not given any way in which of doing that. I mean, what are we supposed to do about it? Does it just mean that we do we just sort of think about God? He doesn't tell us, do we? So if you could imagine at that point bringing in a specific Christian dimension, then, and you could say, and the way to reach God is through confession and repentance and prayer and the sacraments of the church, and then in heaven you will be granted the beatific vision of God. That would be a Christian turn on it, but we don't get anything like that. So that's quite important to bear in mind. And then you see, I think that there are, just as we have this more moderate approach and the extreme approach, when he talks about the way in which the universe is organized, so when philosophy is trying to answer the charge that the wicked prosper and the good suffer, and that, I mean, another thing that Boethius, the prisoner, has said early on is it's interesting. He never denies a belief in God, but he says he thinks that God doesn't care for humanity. He organizes the rest of the universe, but he allows humanity just to, as it were, follow its own devices without organization. And you see this because the wicked prosper and the good suffer. So philosophy has to show why that isn't the case and why God does really care for humans. And as I say, she goes about it in two contrasting ways. One way, and here Boethius draws rather directly on Plato's Gorgias, so that's that one Platonic word dialogue we know he must have known well. The argument is that actually when people, if you oppress other people, if you're unjust to them, then you're doing yourself harm by being, and you're making yourself worse by being unjust. And even if you're a good person being oppressed by somebody who's unjust, that doesn't matter, because they can't take away your goodness from you, and your goodness is all that counts. So you're inviolable. So this way of looking at things is really saying that God doesn't have to interfere. God can just let things happen, because if you act well, so by doing that, ipso facto, you are happy, and you're happy even if you're in prison waiting execution, or even if you're being tortured. Nonetheless, you're happy because you're good, and ditto if you're an evil tyrant, getting great pleasure at seeing your enemies being tortured, but actually you're miserable. That's wretched. You might think you're happy, but you're not. So that's that view. And there's a moment in Book 4 where Boethius the prisoner challenges philosophy and says, well, this really is not. Nobody's really going to believe this, because surely anybody given the choice, rather than being in exile or in a prison or whatever, would prefer to be at home enjoying their comforts. And then philosophy changes her tack, and she gives a very different account, in which she tries to say, well, no, actually, there is a divine providence. God is planning things, and yet he does allow the wicked to oppress the just, but there's a reason for that. For instance, he might be trying to improve people who are good, having them tested to their utmost abilities to make them even better. And these are two different views. And I think, one of the big questions in interpreting the Consolation is does one think that Boethius, the author, has a coherent view, and it all fits together, or is he deliberately leaving gaps? Is he suggesting that philosophy doesn't have a completely coherent view of things.
Right. One of the interesting things about the Consolation, in my opinion, is that Boethius sort of personifies fortune as like Lady Fortune, and she's spinning her wheel. And some people get goods, but just as soon as they get the goods and they're on the top of the food chain, so to speak, they get sent at the bottom. And it's just a matter of the nature of fortune. But in sort of a mysterious way, Lady Philosophy makes the suggestion that no, even what we call fortune or chance, it's under the control of divine providence, as it were.
Yes, yes. I mean, certainly in her, I mean, you could see her taking two views of this. In the view where there is more of a controlled divine providence, yes, fortune is just something in control of divine providence. In the other view, it's less important because fortune, the goods of fortune are not really goods at all, so it doesn't matter so much. I think it's true, though, that Boethius would want to say that ultimately everything is under God's control, which of course is the big problem, which is brought up in Book 5.
Right, right. Well, then I figured maybe we could shift the conversation to discussing Book 5 a bit. I mean, one of the problems Boethius struggles with in the Consolation is the apparent contradiction between God's foreknowledge, especially God's infallible foreknowledge, and the contingency of freedom of the will. And if God knows what's going to happen before I do it, does that mean the action was free? And at least from a literary or rhetorical perspective, it's kind of an interesting tactic to shift from discussing, okay, the problem of evil, why is it that the good prosper and or the good don't prosper and the wicked do, and then he shifts to talking about divine providence, divine foreknowledge and contingency of the will.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's because I think he has. I mean, in answering the former problem, at least with one of the strands, he's committed himself to saying actually something even stronger than divine foreknowledge. He's committed himself to saying, talking about, if you like, divine foreorganization of everything. Now, he doesn't really, except incidentally, take that up. But what he does take up, which would be part of the idea of a God who has every possible excellence, and one of that excellence is the excellence of knowledge. So that a being who has knowledge to the fullest extent knows all things. If he knows all things, then surely he knows the future as well as the past, and doesn't that produce a problem? I suppose there are, I mean, two qualifications to be mentioned here. The first is, if Boethius were following Aristotle, and I think even some of the Platonists, the pagan Platonists, he needn't have had the problem about knowledge at all, because Aristotle in particular insisted that God only knows universals. So God simply, the fact that I'm going to have another cup of tea or something that's just not something that God knows. I mean, why would God bother about that? But of course, the Christian God, it's different. The Christian God has to be concerned with particulars because the Christian God has a relationship with individuals. And Boethius, even in putting this problem, Boethius is assuming, is taking, that we're dealing with the Christian God. So it's actually, it's interesting. It hadn't struck me quite so strongly until I talking to you now about it. It's a very interesting sort of hidden Christian coloring of the whole discussion, even if it appears to be pagan, that this might really probably didn't seem such a problem. There was some discussion about it, but it didn't seem such a problem to pagan writers. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, there's a certain way of thinking about freedom of choice in which the problem doesn't arise because one can consider that we have we have all the freedom that we need, all the freedom for us to be judged morally, without having a genuine freedom to choose between alternatives. And that's a view which you find, you certainly find among a lot of contemporary philosophers from Hume onwards. You arguably find some instances of it earlier on. There are bits of Augustine which seem to read in that way. There are bits there's a Jewish philosopher of the 15th century called Hasdai Crescas who states the view sort of unequivocally. But it's worth, Boethius obviously doesn't have that view. Boethius assumes that in order for human beings to have the freedom that they need to be moral human beings, and for it to be just for God to condemn them for their sins and reward them for their good actions, there has to be a genuine freedom of choice. And it's that which seems to be, it's about that there seems to be a tension with divine omniscience. And here, I think, people looking at the problem now, and indeed if you translate it into contemporary logical terminology, it seems that there are two alternative ways of stating it, which is to say that, on the one hand, if God foreknows what I'm going to do in the future, let's say that I'm going to have this cup of tea afterwards, then that event is not a contingent event, it's a necessary event. And if it's a necessary event, then there was no choice about it, so I wasn't free to do so or not to do so. That's the one side of it. And the other side of it is that if it's not the case that it's a necessary event, so if I really do have a choice between two alternatives, having the cup of tea or not having the cup of tea, so if that's really open and unfixed, then God can't know it. Now, we take the two to be the two sides of the same argument. I think if you look carefully at the argument put by philosophy, she doesn't. She thinks that the first side of the argument, that in some way divine foreknowledge could make what would otherwise be contingent, not contingent, but necessary, is just a bad argument. But she thinks there's a real problem with the second side, which you could put quite simply, that real freedom to choose between alternatives means that the future isn't fixed. Because if the future's fixed, there can't be things can't be open, so I can't choose. But in order to know something, it has to be fixed. Because if it's not fixed, then you could be wrong.
Right.
And the center of the problem is not even that if things were genuinely open, God actually would be wrong, but that he could be wrong. So, take my having this cup of tea. You could suppose in some way that God just wouldn't get it wrong. But if the idea is that God knows that I'm going to have a cup of tea, it's not just a frightfully good guess. If God actually knows I'm going to have a cup of tea, he can only claim to know if my having a cup of tea is fixed. And if it's fixed, then it's not within my choice not to have the cup of tea. So that's the central problem. It's often said that the way in which philosophy solves the problem in consolation is to invoke the idea of God being eternal in a way that's outside time. it's true that that idea comes in, and that's an important idea, but I think that one's taking it too much of a jump to go on to that. And one doesn't see the logical structure of the argument, and also, in fact, the bold, perhaps rather shocking claim that Boethius, the philosopher, has to make in order to get out of the problem. Because when this problem is stated, the first thing that philosophy does is to put forward so-called, or what I call, modes of cognition principle.
Right.
And what she says is that we're quite wrong to think that the truth of things is just to be judged by how things are, which you might think is how the truth of things is to be judged. It's rather that you have to judge the truth of things according to the power of the cognizer.
Right.
So what this is doing is admitting a relativity about truth and about knowledge. It's a relativity, though it's a qualified relativity, because it's hierarchical. So people now who are relativists about truth and knowledge will tend to say, well, no, there are these different claims about what's true and about what knowing made by different knowers, and there's no way, there's no final truth because all these claims are equal. Boethius would say there are so irreconcilably different claims about truth made according to the level of cognition that you have. But these levels of cognition are ordered hierarchically, and one is better than the other. And he explains this very carefully. So at the bottom level, you have what we know through our senses. And he said, what you know through your senses as you feel this thing in front of you, or you hear it, or you see it, is different from what you can grasp using your reason. And using your reason, you can grasp the definition of things. And that's the highest that we can go. But there's a higher level still, and that's God. And it's there that he introduces time. Because what he says is that God's way of understanding things is not spread out and bit by bit as ours. It's to grasp absolutely everything. What we think of past, present, and future in one glimpse. It's just all there for God. And that's how he knows. And because of that, he can then go on to argue that God's knowledge of what seems to us to be future, because it's spread out in time, is actually present to him, because everything's present to him. And so it's right, it's perfectly, he can have knowledge of it, just in the way that we can have knowledge of the present. And so the problem is resolved. And it's important to say that Boethius wants to insist that with regard to some event, like my having a cup of tea, on the one hand, in itself, it really is contingent, it's unfixed. But in relation to God's knowledge of it, it's necessary. That's to say, it's fixed. And he wants to say the two things. He doesn't want to say, as quite a lot of people trying to solve this problem want to do, that in all ways, this is a contingent event. It's, so far as God's concerned, it isn't. There are no contingent events, because everything is necessary, because in the way that everything in the present is necessary. And here I want to say that Boethius's notions about necessity and possibility are very different from our notions today, from philosophers' notions today. They're Aristotelian notions in which modality is reduced to time. So that for Boethius, as for Aristotle, what is, when it is, necessarily is, because it can't be, nothing can be done to change it. Now, from God's point of view, everything that was, is, and will be is now, because God grasps everything. in this one eternal present. And so that's the way that he can reconcile what's seemingly irreconcilable.
As I understand it, the way it was explained to me was the way that God in eternity understands the past, the present, and future. It's analogous to how we understand the present and the necessity that goes along with it. If I'm looking at a person and he or she is sitting, on one hand, that was a free choice. They could have done otherwise, but insofar as they're sitting, they are necessarily sitting. They can't both stand and sit.
Yes. No, that's absolutely right. But it's, in talking about it in that way, one's using the Aristotelian conception of modality, because in saying that, what you're saying is that if I'm sitting now, it's not possible that I'm not sitting now. It's necessary that I'm sitting now. Which I mean I think is a very good common sense position, because I can stand up at the next moment, but at this very moment, that moment is occupied by my sitting. But ask any contemporary philosopher, and they would say, no, it's perfect. I'm sitting now, but it's possible that I'm not sitting now, because it's possible that there will be some other possible world in which I'm not sitting now. Now that's just a way in which Boethius didn't think at all. But it means that his law, we have in a way to put ourselves into the frame of his thinking about modality in order to understand his argument.
Interestingly enough, Boethius, I think he makes kind of a quick remark in the dialogue that we've sort of assumed that God's knowledge of things is passive, rather than God's knowledge of things is sort of being the cause of their being, or rather it being the other way around, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think there might even be good reason to think that that's Boethius himself's opinion. But if that's the case, does Lady Philosophy really answer the difficulty of the problem for Boethius? And if not, what sort of reason does Boethius have for setting up the debate like this?
Yeah, so right. I think that Boethius's own view, Boethius' philosopher, must have been that God doesn't know because things are like that. Things are like that because God knows, as you say. And there's one bit early in the discussion where Boethius, the prisoner, says just in parenthesis, of course, no, we're talking as if God knew things because they're so, but actually it's the other way around. But right at the end, he refers back to that comment, and he suggests that the solution that he's given somehow solves that problem too. That somehow, because God sees everything in an instant, well, there's no problem even if God is bringing about what he sees. But it really doesn't seem to be a satisfactory answer, because if God is responsible for it, it doesn't seem to matter whether God's responsible for it in a moment or no, not. So I think that I don't think that Boethius, the writer, can think that he's really solved the problem there. It's a sort of, it's a vague gesture.
Sure.
And that's, a point which we haven't really gone into, but I've alluded to various times, is the oddity that here's Boethius, a Christian as we know, facing death, who writes a work in which there's no explicit mention of Christianity. He's in dialogue with a pagan philosophy. There are one or two moments where we seem to have an allusion to scripture. And it's interesting, those allusions are not in philosophy's mouth, they're in Boethius's mouth. So it's hard to know how to read them. You could just dismiss them and say, well, Boethius was so steeped in scripture that he couldn't help letting a bit of it come in. But you could say that it's a deliberate hint to readers that Boethius, the character, is a Christian. And the way in which one of these, as a reference to the what we now think of as the apocryphal book of wisdom, is put, does suggest that. It does seem to be a broad hint to the reader that I really am one of you, although I'm talking in pagan terms. So the question is, what does all this amount to? And there's, what I think an extreme interpretation, but an interesting one, put forward by somebody who's mostly a literary critic called Joel Relihan, who puts a lot of weight on this point that I mentioned before, about the genre, the Menippean satire genre, being one where authority is held up to ridicule. And his view is that Boethius is the consolation of philosophy is a consolation in which consolation doesn't take place. Philosophy doesn't succeed in consoling Boethius. And what we're supposed to gather from that is that philosophy is inadequate. So it's a work, it's a sort of deeply Christian work by the back door. I think most people reject that interpretation, right? I don't follow it. Because it seems in order to follow it, you have to pretend that all these arguments that Boethius worked out so carefully are just there, so they're just supposed to be bad arguments.
Right.
They're clearly not just bad arguments. And however, I think that there is if you like, there's a moderate way between interpretation which takes philosophy as an unreservedly authoritative figure and presented as such and to be followed by Boethius, the author, and Relihan's one which takes philosophy as a false authoritative figure. And it's something you can take by actually taking up things that philosophy says about herself, because philosophy says something, this is past my understanding. This is philosophy doesn't pretend that she grasps everything. And what I think that Boethius, the author, is trying to do, and it comes out also in the way that the arguments don't quite fit together. So the most striking one is this question about, does God bring things about by knowing, or are things known because they are? But there's the other one between the monolithic and the non-monolithic conception of the good, and there are two different views of providence. I think what he's trying to do is to say, look, philosophy can do a lot. Philosophy is wonderful, and I can show you how following a philosophical view can console you, can show you what are true goods. It's well worth doing this, and having spent my life as a philosopher, I haven't gone wrong. But I think at the same time, he's trying to say, but don't think that it can take you everywhere. Don't think that there are limits, and philosophy knows that there are limits beyond which it can't go. And so there are aspects of what I'm saying, which, what gets said in the conversation, which are not complete. And for that, you need to turn to something else. And then perhaps the biggest thing which is incomplete is what I said that earlier, that we're told that there is God who is the good, but we're not at all told how to get to God. And I think all there he's saying, this is something different. This is for religion. But I'm not a priest, and I'm not a confessional religious writer. I'm a philosopher. So what I'm doing is giving you the consolation of philosophy as far as it goes, and it goes a long, long way. But also, I'm trying to imply, if you're a really careful reader, that's not enough, and you need to turn to God. And that, in a sense, is why people talk about it being unfinished. But in fact, it ends with that. It ends with his turning to God and thinking of us acting under this God who sees all things. And now it's for us to act. It's for us to. I mean, again, one of the important things that the argument that divine prescience doesn't stop freedom has established is that prayer can be useful. Prayer is valuable. That was he was afraid that divine prescience might mean that prayer wasn't of use. So I think that it leads you to the point of prayer, and leaves you there, because that's not something which Boethius wants to do.
So, Dr. Marenbon, if I can ask, do you have any recommendations or secondary literature that you'd recommend for folks who'd want to study more about Boethius or the Consolation? I suppose there's your work that
what I think what people could look at, if you're if you want to go on a bit, want to look into it a bit more deeply, is the Cambridge Companion to Boethius. Now, I edited it, but no, if you like, that's I'm not pointing anything to what I did. So it's mostly by a group of other scholars who don't. I mean, a lot of them have different views about it, but I think that's a good work. There's also now a Brill's Companion to Boethius. Yeah, I get the. I think the editor is called Philip. It's called Philip Phillips, I think or he's one of the editors. And it's more recent. It's in a way a complementary book, because a lot of it is about the influence and the influence in different periods. So that's a good thing. And other things. I mean, there was a book written published about 1980 by Henry Chadwick, who was a very, very fine scholar. And he calls it Boethius, the Consolations of various sort of music or philosophy and so on. And that's a very, Chadwick was fantastically learned in ancient philosophy. And so you get a lot of that. So if you want somebody who can really throw light on the ancient roots of a lot of what Boethius says, it's very good there. And also he looks at the biographical side very fully. He goes through the arithmetic and the music, and Chadwick was actually somebody, I think, who studied music himself. So he and I find that very technical and very difficult, but he goes through all of that. So if you want somebody, as I say, of great learning, trying to look at the whole of Boethius, that's a book to read too.
Well, Dr. Marenbon, I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover. Thank you so much for coming on.
Not at all. Thank you for talking to me and for your very good questions. And I hope that because of the way in which you conducted the conversation, this will be an interesting episode for your listeners.